All right, welcome everybody to another edition of our panel series. Here we're going to explore topics that are central to our discussion and the challenges in the climate farmers community with leaders and innovators in their fields. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the importance of seeds, which is very dear to my heart because on my own small farm, I'm dedicating a large part of my actions to landrace breeding, trying to figure out what grows well on the very unique conditions on my farm. But we're also not just talking about the diversity and the variety of different plants, though we will discuss that as well, but rather the diversity that is contained within plants. We'll discuss the preservation of heritage seeds, the importance of breeding landrace varieties to adapt to the changing conditions that we discussed a little bit before we started the recording, and many other aspects of this. And so if you are interested in joining in any of these conversations, I would encourage you to sign up for the Climate Farmers community. It's free to join for anybody who is actively farming in Europe. And there we are constantly developing new resources and support mechanisms for farmers who are in transition to regenerative management. Discuss with your peers and learn from other farmers who are on this journey. And we have, a growing list of resources to help you along your way. So to get us started, maybe we could have a quick introduction from our panelists. Anders, you haven't been on the panel before and haven't had an appearance on the podcast either. So let's hear from you first. Could you tell us a bit about your work and what brings you into the world of seed breeding and agriculture?
Yeah, my name is Anders born from Denmark. I started in '83 as an organic farmer, and then turned into agronomy and studied seed pathology. And for the past 15 years, I've mainly been involved in research and plant breeding in cereals. So I breed organic cereals for, in particular, wheat, but also some rye and barley. And the main focus is to meet the challenges that organic farmers have in our climate. So our main focus is actually protein content in wheat. In order to make a decent baking quality in Denmark, we need special varieties in organic farming because the nitrogen supply is lower than in conventional, and therefore the conventional varieties are adapted for high input conditions, and therefore they give poor baking quality when they're grown without nitrogen. So these are some of my main challenges. I focus very much on populations. And that means rather than pure line varieties, I breed populations. I started out with heritage varieties because they solve some of the problems, in particular regarding protein content and wheat competition. But I face the problems that they often are susceptible to plant diseases. And also the baking quality is often poor in heritage varieties. So that's why I started developing new ones, trying to combine the good traits from the heritage varieties and combine them with traits from modern varieties.
Fascinating. Thank you, Anders. We'll come back and explore the mechanisms of that very soon. But first, let's go to Harriet. Can you give us a short introduction? Though we could also go back to the previous ones we've recorded. I don't know how many times you're going to have to introduce yourself on this series. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm basically a biologist that has grown into understanding the plant, put it this way. So my personal journey started being a foodie and really wanting to have the good vegetables of my childhood back. And I couldn't. So first I thought, okay, this is just a thing about heirlooms. And it wasn't. It turned out that the culture method is just about as important. And so I joined these fields, and as I'm from a scientist background and have the illness of curiosity, I wanted to explain these things. And this is why I'm at the point where I'm now. So the last step is that I'm really expanding in the teaching. So we are just opening a website. It's just going online, and I'm glad to be here because I really, really like to discuss this seed topic because so many people are afraid of it. And I'm always trying to drop this into the other talks and kind of hijack them a bit to talk about seed saving, but it's not as catching as mineral nutrition, for example.
Yeah, this is exactly why I was excited to have you on this panel, because we've had many discussions before about soil science and plant health, and many times those discussions have wandered into the genetics and the necessity to work with seeds. And so I'm very excited to explore that with you today. Now let's move to Glenn. Glenn, can you give us a bit of an introduction into your work and your work specifically with finding and keeping heritage and landrace varieties alive?
Well, I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for Anders. Thank you, Anders. I was lucky enough to have a succession of mentors because I was in the hotel and restaurant business for almost a half century. And I woke up one day and said, I think I'm going to burn all my suits in the parking lot. For whatever reason, I couldn't even tell at the time. But I had rice for an event. It showed up and it really wasn't ready to go. And I spent the whole time in my suit with the dishwashers in the kitchen, sweating to death, picking the rice so we could get it up to serve it. And I was supposed to be presenting at that too, about the history of Southern food, since I'm in the South in the United States, specifically South Carolina. But what happened was really simple. I only had to go across the river. Very, very lucky. The Schultz family was there and they were already growing Carolina Gold rice, which is the legacy rice here, which had already transited the globe and was one of the #1 land races being grown in Hawaii when I started, and still is quite present there. It was in India on forced introductions, and in Japan they brought it in through the Black Curtain. It was so prized there. So it has a spotty history all around the globe, but the origin is Sulawesi. And I found out immediately, since I didn't know very much about growing crops, especially landrace crops, that I had to have rotations prior to planting and or intercrops with them. And that led to a whole list of diversity that's required for landrace farming. And we manage chem-free. All of our growers are certified organic. We do our own seed globally and also here in the US extensively. We make the seed available to any qualified farmers for starter seed. So we do a lot of that work in vetting farmers, and we're way down the road with that, having given 25 years of success and failures. And finding that climate change has been both horrible to us over the last 6 years and fantastic to us, up to and including Helene, which wiped out a good portion of our research and everything else in Appalachia last year, et cetera, et cetera. So we've seen good side, bad sides of economies and everything. And what I'm finding out after a quarter century, and certainly Anders and others will back this up, that landrace farming, everybody tells you it doesn't work. We still have people who are world renowned that come by occasionally who are in advanced genetics doing CRISPR and things like that. And they look at me and they say, why are you doing this? You could do so much more in production, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going, how many billions of times have I heard that? Because you need these genetics. And if I'm not growing them, you don't have true land races because they're not being hand selected and they're not being true type and they're not being tested phenotypically. And how the hell do we go forward if you don't have base genetics with a place-based, identity preserved quality? So we moved into this sphere just by accident. And frankly, Anders was a big catalyst in making this happen. So thank you, Anders. And that's it for us. Today, we're all over the place with all kinds of stuff, but the rice harvest we're having, as I mentioned earlier, is probably the best one we've ever had, and nobody knows why. And by the way, I've got a blue-green chem-free rice crop. It's a seed crop that's just out of hedgerow, and I've never seen blue-green in rice before. Normally, I associate that with lots of chemicals, but this was a chem-free, totally clean research plot, and I don't know where that came from. And it's in the middle of Arkansas in the United States, where it did nothing but rain this year and everybody was late. There's still flood signs up in 20% of Arkansas right now in the center of the state. And we made everywhere. I can't believe it. We're very, very lucky. So that's us.
Well, that is fascinating. And Glenn, I really appreciate the definitions and the explanations that you have for the difference in all of these terms that we're going to be exploring today. Can you give us a quick overview about the differences between heritage varieties, landrace varieties? Some people talk about ancient grains or modern grains, or give us some context as to what these terms mean.
Well, the word heirloom, as everybody that's on this panel knows, is in our country anyhow, agreed that it has to be at least X ago, not including Mendelian. We've well past that. Now heirloom can include Mendelian breeding. So the idea of landrace and hand-to-hand breeding, meaning you go in and hand select the purity and the true type phenotypic response that you want in the landrace you're working with to continue it that way every year. It's done by hands and by understanding where you're going with the genetics. And these days we can have fast shoots like for rice, we've got the entire genome. So we can get comps that way quite easily. And that helps on purity, but we're actually looking at the plant for taxonomy and morphology, for true type replication. And it really, for land races, only works chem-free because there is a massive reaction to chemical farming in true land races. It's not the same plant. It doesn't taste the same, doesn't have the same aroma flavor profile. And a lot of times it even affects the morphology. I can't get a lot of geneticists that are frontline to go with that, but that's my observation as an amateur in the field. By the way, my name in the field with my geneticists that I work with is Tractor Donkey. That shows you where they think my understanding of genetics is.
Well, I mean, it takes the people who are out there doing the work and collecting and observing these seeds to keep them going. And as we've discussed in previous discussions, this is how we got all of the domesticated crops we currently have. It wasn't through PhD researchers and people fooling with the genetics under a microscope. It was through this timeless process of relationship and interaction with these plants. Now, I want to go back to Anders real quick to explain then what we're talking about breeding a population and not staying true to type with the work that you're doing. What is the advantage? What are we talking about here? Why is this important?
Well, there are different aspects of it. One of the advantages of land races, I mean, true land races, the difference, my definition is, in order to be a true land race, you need a genetic diversity within the crop, compared to modern pure line varieties where you have, at least in self-pollinating crops, all plants are genetically identical within a crop or within a variety, whereas a land race will always include genetic diversity. And this genetic diversity has an advantage in cropping. Yeah, I mean, you can also create it by a variety mixture, that when you have a diversity in resistance genes, they will not all be susceptible to the same pathogens, or if they have a difference in root structure, they will take up nutrients at different times and in different profiles in the soil. And therefore, diversity in itself has an advantage in yield and also in stability, in particular in stability. We also see it in baking quality, that if you have a genetic diversity in baking quality, there is a synergy between, for example, in wheat, is the difference in the diversity in glutenines. It will interact with each other and actually create a better baking quality. So one of the disadvantages of modern plant breeding and modern seed production is actually a yield decrease. You lose a few percent just by having pure line varieties. And therefore land races for some has advantages alone through the genetic diversity. And what I do in my breeding is not to go for land races because they also have negative traits. So I kind of try to develop modern varieties. So I go for specific traits, but then I make sure that the populations that are developed, it includes a genetic diversity. That answers your question.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. Now, I want to go from some of the terms and the definitions as well as processes. And Harriet, can you talk to us about why seeds have become a hands-off topic to discuss, especially in agriculture, and why it's so important to bring this to the forefront of the conversation, especially in regenerative agriculture.
Hmm. I think there are different reasons. I mean, what I see that, of course, legislation is a major problem here. So that it's not allowed to share and trade your own seeds freely. And one thing is also, I feel that this tradition is kind of interrupted between the generations. So when I started to talk about, especially with farmers, I mean, in the gardening scene, you have the easy ones like tomatoes. Everybody crops tomato seeds, of course, and passes it on. It's a piece of cake. But when you need a certain gene pool, like who wants to grow 70 cabbages and overwinter them and then go in the field next year, grow them all out, and then having X kilograms of seeds, what do you do with it? You know? So for many plant species, it needs cooperation and distribution. And if the people are not skilled that do this, if you join, you very often have varieties that are not maintained well. So you just source a variety somewhere, it was not well selected, and then you grow it out, and it's just misbehaving rascals in your garden, and you say, hey, what's this? You know? So getting good germplasm is one thing in sufficient quantities, because, for example, if you write to the IPK gene bank in Gattersleben for corn, you get so little seed, you can't start something with this. Now, earlier on, you got ample, but now you just get a little bit. And then what? And then you start, and a slug comes along and just goes with 3 of your precious supposed ancestors of your population, and you just sit there and cry. You know, it's just you need really, if you want to start and not lose too much time until you bulk it up, it's good if you have a decent quantity to start with. And then with farmers, very often it's really the fear of yield losses, of malperforming varieties, and the process itself. Like, is it much work? How much do I reserve? Will I have cross-pollination? Or they simply don't know it. Like, for example, once I gave corn to a farmer that was a friend, and I said, would you just... So we have a large group of individuals that we can select from. And I asked, is anybody growing corn there? No, not at all. Not at all. And I came to the field and just... on the other side, there was the next corn, and I was like, okay, forget it, man. So there is things that you just need to know, and you just need to have experience over time, what you can do, what you shouldn't do. And if you fail big, it really hurts. So it's a learning curve. And as not so many people do it, especially on farm scale here, I do not know anybody except one lady that has some heirloom corns that does it really for commercial sale. You're a bit the nerd when you do seed saving.
So tell me, why go through all the bother then? You basically just listed all the reasons not to do this. Why is this important to participate in then?
It's my conviction that if you really want to have locally adapted plants that are resilient and that grow on microbially powered soils, there is no way around it. And it's so much fun. So much fun. Because, I mean, okay, sometimes I admit I have been standing in front of what I grew and I was like, I'm not going to do this ever again. Like, you have been selecting for something that is smooth, and then it has all little spines on it. And when you do cleaning of the seeds, it hurts. And you're like, no, never again. But in general, I have not done in my life many more things that were just really more fun. Because I came from university, you do Mendel, you do all these things, and then you think, yeah, I know it all. And you go down and into the field and you start doing all these things. And it's a different world. They do what they want, especially once you have microbes and changes in nutritional management. It's incredible, the plasticity of plants, of their architecture, of how they deal with their surroundings, of their capacity. It's unheard of. Nobody wants to speak about that at university. Maybe they start now and it's called then epigenetics or this and that. Or this is how it's starting to become popular. But there is so many phenomena and it's so fast and I find it so fluid. It's incredible fun to work with this. I love it.
I love the stories of your personal connection there. I am very early in the process of doing these things myself, and I can relate to the very steep highs and very low lows.
Oh, it hurts
of working
sometimes,
with
really.
the seeds. Yeah, absolutely. Glenn, can you take us forward with this? You mentioned that you really got into this as a rediscovery of Carolina gold rice that you remember from your childhood and the revival and the connection with the culture that you were part of, and have since moved into so many other cultivars as well. Talk about how important this is for the culture of where you are, the heritage and the resilience of these cultivars, and what the process looks like on the larger scales and within the community networks that you also participate with.
Yes, one of the wonderful things that I learned directly from Anders way back was that you needed to have biosecurity. And I didn't even know what that meant when I started out. But my first lesson, which a lot of people will recognize, is my very first field of 35 acres of absolute true type Carolina gourd seed corn, which is distinct from Texas and Virginia gourd seed, single ear per stalk, 14 feet tall, all the wrong things you want for a biosecure crop, with intercrops of peas. And, the field was gorgeous. And I can remember standing there with the guy, Doug Bullock, who was teaching me, because he had done this since he was a kid and his family had been around since the 1600s doing the same thing. And this is in the rural Tyner, South Carolina. And Doug and I were walking the field and he was pointing out anomalies and things of interest because he'd done it all his life. And this was his family corn. And he looked up and he saw a bank of clouds. He said, "Well, we're done." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "I'm sorry, we're finished here." And he started walking out of the field. I said, "Doug, where are you going?" He said, "Look over there." And he pointed at the cloud bank again. I said, "Oh, okay, so what?" He said, "This corn's not going to be standing in about 35 minutes. And I didn't believe him. I stayed in the field. He went home. And I watched the whole field go down. That was my first corn crop. And I said, "Oh, biodiversity, biosecurity. Oh, I get it. You've got to do it in more than one place, because if you do it in just one place, you never know what's going to happen." So that started us on where we thought being in the community, sharing seeds, and making sure that there's a backup plan for everything, both by hand, right? And in any other way you can do it, but we specialize only in what you can do with this. So I said, okay, we'll provide genetics to people who are doing advanced breeding. We'll go into biosecurity and look for short season crops. We'll find an answer for a long season crop that blows down. And we tested this out after Helene. We supplied a lot of farmers with seed on short season basis. And we have that whole initiative now with geneticists who are looking for short season crops and working with us. And we're very, very lucky to do that. And again, we just had an unbelievable call from the National Rice Research Center in Arkansas from Dr. Travis Huggins and Dr. Yulin Zhao. Both of them had discovered 6 landrace short grain rices that, given the right conditions, would, from direct seed, top seed, so that we're not even talking sticking it in the ground, right? Just top seeding to food harvest dry in less than 40 days.
Wow.
And the target is less than 50 days. 7 cultivars, and they just sent them to us. just this week. So this is precipitous, because what do you do if you're a farmer and your whole crop disappears? Well, if you've got enough daylight and heat and degree days, you can go to these crops. So that's a program we're doing too. All land races. These were in the GRIN. No one's paying attention to them, right? GRIN is our grain system for heirloom and land race crops, and then they've got modern cultivars too. But for us, finding short season rices like that is actually the assignment worldwide. And we see, interesting enough, more interest in this in Indonesia than any place else in the world right now, because we have a geneticist, and two actually from there who we work with directly, the Tavaraja family, Dil Rushki and Tava Tavaraja, both professors at Clemson University, who have been studying this their entire lives because they grew up in Indonesia. Their families are there, and they just took this all for granted. And they're working with winter chickpea cultivars that are super fast for our winter environment here as a winter legume, where they were never introduced before here. So that's the kind of stuff that's going on. And they're doing it totally chem-free themselves. It's 100% certified organic. And we're talking to geneticists that really care about the future of biosecurity. So that's our program right now.
And that is really exciting. And congratulations on kind of rediscovering and getting access to these new varieties. I can't wait to hear what comes of this. Now, Anders, I want to go to the more specific example that you have been working with wheat there in Denmark. Can you give us an overview of what it looks like, and maybe what the timelines or the process is of working on pest or disease susceptibility in a staple crop in your area, and some of the characteristics that you're looking for, and how to participate in this process from someone who's been doing it for a while?
Well, as I said, the aim is to develop varieties or populations that fit for organic conditions, and I do the breeding under organic conditions. The seed production is under organic conditions. But according to the new standards for organic farming, you can grow organic seed from seed that has actually been conventionally produced. And so you can say actually that the seed that most organic farmers use in their organic fields have only been grown for 1 or 2 years organically. Before that, they were grown conventionally. And this is doesn't make much difference when you're talking about leaf diseases that comes with wind or rain or from the soil. But it makes a difference in seed-borne diseases, because many seed-borne diseases, they don't follow the crop rotation or the wind, they follow the seed. So the more years you grow seed without seed treatment, you may build up a population of pathogens, of seed-borne pathogens. And in cereals, or in particularly wheat, the most important is a common bunt. You may not know it, but it is my favorite disease. I've been working with this disease for 40 years. And immediately when Martin Wolf in England started working with wheat populations, my first thought is, if you're going to grow populations and multiply them organically, you're going to run into problems with common bunt. It's inevitable. So therefore, my main focus, yes, maybe my main focus, but at least you have to have resistance to this disease. Either a seed treatment that works under organic conditions, which is expensive and not very effective, or you need to have resistance. So a main focus in my breeding has been resistance to common bunt, because it's a really nasty disease. There's only a few plants in the field that can make a major problem. It stinks like rotten fish, so you discard the whole crop if you're infected. So in my breeding, I focus on this, and all conventional varieties are susceptible. I even had cooperation with a conventional breeder, and they started, or at least the wheat breeder in this company, he started breeding for bunt resistance. And when the manager of the company found out that he was breeding for resistance, he was told to to stop the breeding program and throw it all away. Burn it and don't tell anybody about it. Because for a conventional company, they don't want resistance. Because if their varieties are resistant, then farmers will start producing their own seed, and then they lose business. So it's very important for conventional farmers or for conventional seed companies that varieties are susceptible. So you won't find any resistance in modern varieties, at least not something they did by heart. So the only place we can find resistance is in heritage varieties, or in a few places in the world where they have dwarf bund, a special kind of bund disease that are not seed-borne but mainly soil-borne, and seed treatment doesn't work. So therefore, in some case, in Austria and Sweden and Pacific Northwestern America, they had breeding programs for bund resistance because they have dwarf bund. But the rest of the world only have common bund, and there the seed producers prefer susceptible varieties. And then we also have to consider this biosafety, because biosafety is also about genetic resources. It's wonderful that we can go to the gene banks and find genetic resources. But that's kind of an ex situ conservation. You store seed in a deep freezer or in some other way, and then, but seeds will not stay there forever. So you freeze maybe some genetic resources, but you also freeze the development. You freeze the dynamic, which was previously maintained by farmers producing land races, because in the land races you have the genetic diversity, you have radiation from the cosmic radiations that create mutations all the times, and small mutations will be conserved in land races. But in modern varieties, you lose this, and you also lose it in gene banks. We have seen one of the biggest gene banks was in Aleppo in Syria. It was destroyed under the civil war. We have a big gene bank in Ukraine, in Kherson, that is destroyed by Russian bombings. So we lose, and also mistakes. Also in Denmark, it seems like a peaceful country, but the Nordic Gene Bank also in a period 5-10 years ago was suffering from politicians that were not really aware, so they didn't have money to maintain the gene bank. So also in gene banks, we lose diversity. And this is why its seed-saving work is important, because we have the ex situ conservation in the gene bank, but we should always also have in situ conservation among farmers. Yes, we have ex situ conservation of tigers and rhinos in the zoo, but that's not enough. If rhinos only survive in the zoo, there's no point in it. It's only by having nature that you can maintain rhinos on a long term, and only by having land races in farmers' field is the only way we can have a sustainable seed system. And we need that. For example, when I do breeding for bund resistance, because I need resources. We need genetic resources in order to make new varieties. We cannot get new traits from future varieties. They're not developed yet. We can only get them from old varieties. So all new development, all progress in plant breeding is based on old varieties. And they need to be preserved in order to make new varieties. Well, I'm out of the line now. What did you ask?
No. I really appreciate you making such a strong point there, and I agree with that importance. We often talk about maintaining biodiversity on farms as if it was just a matter of having diversity of plants. And very often we miss the importance of having diversity within those plants and their ability, their epigenetic adaptations, their interbreeding possibilities, their possibilities of promiscuous pollination, to use Joseph Lofthaus's term, that keeps them adapting and keeps them viable within the changing conditions, right? These are not museum pieces. And keeping them in museum-like genetic banks is not going to keep them moving into the future along with us. And so I really appreciate you kind of hammering that point home. Now, Harriet, the other part of this that you have illustrated for us in previous conversations is the need for plants to be able to survive in the soil conditions that are changing as well. There are very few healthy, functioning, intact soils in most agricultural environments. And many of the seeds that are coming into those fields are bred under conditions where they are basically being force-fed their nutrition to limp along to produce a yield. And if we want, well, I'll let you explain it a little bit better, but we're trying to find the plants that can make the connections to soil microbiology that help the adaptation process. And well, I'll let you take it from there to, to explain it much better than I was about to.
Okay. I'm just going to be a bit naughty and give 2 comments on what was said before, because otherwise it's just gone. So one comment on winter chickpeas. It's, for example, I'm not sure if you have worked with a Hanan pop bean. By accident, I discovered that this one is pretty winter hardy. I have early sown, and then we got late frost spells, and everything died. And surprisingly, the Hanan pop bean turned out to be pretty frost resistant. So this is a fun little chickpea and has many virtuous traits I found. I like it a lot. And the next thing is about this museum preservation, and this will be the bridge back into microbiology. So when I was multiplying seeds for the Arca Noah, I found, well, you get these very old seeds and you plant them. Oh my God. And until they mount, until they show really signs of life, sometimes it's really hard. And then eventually they get going. Okay. Then you're really glad that you've cropped them. And for the sake of maintaining diversity, they go back into the gene bank. But you don't select them. So I found that really to bring them forward, you need to use them. If I have a cucumber and I just, for maintaining it and it's bitter, I'm just not even seeing it. If I'm consuming it, if I'm living with it, I will select it because this nasty taste will just never make it into my jars. And just really using these plants quickly eliminates many varieties that are heirlooms that are just in this game because they are pretty. They're beautiful. Because you can't depend on them. And then you have, you know, I think everybody goes manic at some points, for example, in these beautiful bean varieties, and they just look fantastic and you want them all. And then you have 200 in your cupboard. And you think, now I'm doing it. Yes, but in the end, if you have a special soil, maybe 10 are performing well only. And when you start to really live with these 10, then you start to develop them and to really have your good, true best friends with you, and you're selecting them. And one part of this, and here I come back to Oliver, is, are they working with your management? And how much are you willing to twist yourself to maintain the plants that work for you? Because in the end, when you really live with them, you want reliable plants that you like eating. Because many times you have a plant that's maybe reliable, but you don't like to cook it. And then what's the point? Or you have something that you find it's a wonderful plant and it's totally tasty, but it just always dies of disease very early in the season. Also pointless. And this is when the fun of breeding sets in, when you say, maybe I can combine these two and get something that I do like and that performs well here. Or the bees do the job for you and you just find an accidental cross. And then you start working with this cross. So obviously, in a setting where mono is important, homogeneous harvest windows, the same response to fertilization, all these things. And when you want to see genetic uniformity, this is a disturbance. when you work with these things with your hands, it's a cornucopia of starting points. This is the big difference for me. And here, what I found impressive was the difference of modern and older varieties handling microbiology. When I started on this journey, I thought, yeah, there's not so much difference. On the ones you pour nitrate, and on the other ones you pour manure, and they will just do the job. Oh no. Over the time, I found that this is by no means so interchangeable as you think. There is some varieties that make this switch very easily and that are capable of handling microbes as well as heavy fertilization. But I have not seen many. Very often it's that these are really bred and adapted to one of these ways and they underperform in the other setting. So if we have here a lot of cereal specialists, maybe an example from there, modern dwarfed cereal varieties, for example, they do not cooperate with mycorrhizae well. There is different degrees where this cooperation is impacted for the negative. But that means that if you want to go down in fertilization and really rely on fungal mobilization from the soil and transport into the plant, so you reap all the benefits that are tied to the mycorrhizae, like better water use efficiency, better disease resistance, and better nutrient acquisition overall, and these deeper, bigger root systems, so you have a better carbon input into the soil. Then you really need to check if this given variety that you're particularly fond of will work with these microbes, that it's able to handle them, to feed them, to control them, and that it really has this growth boost that is usually associated with the presence of fitting mycorrhizae. So the complexity is when you start to dissect it in a reductionist way is mind-boggling and it's scary. But you just can't go out there and do it. You just can't change your management, make a pilot, just throw some heirlooms out there or some landraces and whatever you like to inoculate them with, set your fertilizer program and see who performs. And this is what I like so much. You can either really think about it and try to go the precision way, or you just say, okay, I just get my hands dirty and I start doing it. And in general, modern plants have lost the ability to work with fungi in this domestication process. So when you work with old varieties that are a species dependent on fungal partners, your soils have to provide this, or this plant will be an unhappy underperformer. Notorious for this are eggplant, for example. And the modern varieties have been bred to really be fueled with soluble nitrogen. If you grow old ones, you better have fungi around to do the job. Did this answer your question, Oliver?
It sure did. And the way that you summed this up in a previous conversation is with all the farmers that we're talking about who are considering a shift in their management to some quote unquote version of regenerative. One thing is to switch away from using certain fertilizers or reduce chemical inputs. And another is to have the seeds that accompany a different type of management. And that there may be a glass ceiling that you'll be able to reach with doing all the right things, but perhaps the seeds, the industrial seeds that you're using are just never going to meet you halfway and adapt to the management that you are using, especially if you're not cultivating and living with them and developing them over time. Moving to Glenn, now, this is something that you've talked about a lot with me in a previous conversation of bringing the culture back into agriculture, and that many of these crops are not just something that you put in the ground and manage with the same machinery and the same rotations as you would perhaps a more industrial variety, but that they grew in specific polycultures. Everyone can think back to the three sisters, so common of Native American agriculture, but that is by far not the only one. And that some of these rice varieties, I believe you told me, go in parallel with peas, or some are clumping and require a different management entirely. And so one thing is getting access to the seed, and another is rediscovering the cultivation, the culture that goes with growing these crops. Can you speak to that among the many different varieties that you're working with?
Yes, the international, it looks like when you dig deep that the international idea of polyculture continues to come up over and over and over again. The closer you look, the more the histories are not elaborated by arrivals instead of residents. That's a nice way to put it. You find that the resident system becomes global presence when you think about ancient culture in the present, which means no one monocrops with the exception of seed. That comes under kosher law with Hebrew culture. It's in the Muslim arena all across the planet. It's in Indonesia, certainly in Hawaii, which is where I learned a lot. I learned some of this from Anders too, that polyculture actually gives company, and also as simply put as, if you don't grow sorghum before rice, you can be growing beautiful rice, everything's fine. And if you happen to have a flood, because we do intermittent floods, so we want to stay aerobic, which means the roots have oxygen instead of there's no oxygen around. Different plant, by the way, with landraces, different plant completely with oxygen at the roots versus in rice, where you're working full flood and you have this nice pond and rice growing out of it. Those roots are anaerobic, no oxygen present, and a whole different plant, whole different susceptibility, and a different kind of uptake. So when you stop and think about it, all of the challenges that we have in rice horticulture, which also applies to wheat and everything else, people talk about understories and co-crops. That's the first step in polyculture. And that actually starts giving a full farm, long rotation, soil nutrient, and everybody's looking only at soil then. And the seeds are kind of superfluous. It's building soil. So when you do something as romantic as like the term 4x4 hillock check, which is essentially the clumps you talked about, which means everything is on a hill and there's all the plant species there that ward off all the things that can attack. The other thing that's built into this system is space. Being in the rice stuff, if we grow ancient rices that are super tall, the most fun thing in the world is to go away and come back and see glassy water straight across right after a flood, because that means the neems hit it and they ate the entire crop. It's going to come back. It'll come back. It'll do its own ratoon, it's called. It's the second crop. But the first time I saw that, I almost had a heart attack, right? That's kind of like seeing my corn blown down. But what I find out is, had I run sorghum with or without the crop, before the crop, and I would have a natural neem suppressor. Then I get into sorghum. And when I find out that I can run some chickpeas and I can run some unguiculatas, commonly known here as cowpeas, or what we have Sea Island peas, because on our South Carolina coast was where the first peas were grown by the Jesuits, and the introduction came from Africa directly through the Jesuits, and Spanish and both French, and we had British doing the same introductions too. So those unguiculatas carry their own nuances with regard to intercropping. So you have polyculture. Instead of just one crop, you end up with a bunch of crops, and then you harvest, and the word triage comes up. And triage, we associate these days with emergency medical facilities within war zones and stuff like that. But before the Great Depression in the 30s and 20s, triage was what happened after you harvested polyculture in Europe. It's obviously a French term. So nothing that's happened here on our continents, plural, is original, we either owe it to European, native, African, Indonesian, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We had massive influence from China in the 18th and 19th centuries, and we don't even note that these days, and it was part of the survival of American horticulture. And I'm talking about America's, all three continents. So in that system, you see resonance and biosecurity, and it does change the way the plants are. Their phenotypic response is they notice they have neighbors, and all of a sudden, in the ancient native terms, in all three continents we have, it's called magic. Levels. It's how you speak to the gods in their terms. And I spent a ton of times with the tribes growing up here, which are known as nations, which are native people that actually really belong here. So we studied hugely with Wampanoag, the Navajo, the Hopi, in our area, Catawba, who were trading from South America to what we call Nova Scotia before any Vikings or anybody else showed up on this continent. They were ocean-going canoes taking Yopan from here to South America, which is a co-crop with cereals, especially wild rice, et cetera, et cetera. It's in that same canon. So we have the history prior to first contact that still is retained on the Sea Islands and to somewhat by the Catawba Nation and definitely in Appalachia here. There's massive lessons to be learned in their techniques. So that's my summary, right? If you look back in ancient horticulture, nobody had the kind of breeding we have today. Nobody had anything. So if you dig deep and look for phenotypic response and change, as Anders mentioned, in land races, you're looking for what's different in the field when you're really breeding. You never toss out offs, as we call them. You always take them aside and study it. And then you find out if you've discovered something new. That's the fun of land races anyhow. So this has been great fun, and thanks for the time.
Thank you. Well, look, I can think of so many more questions I would love to ask, but I will hand this over now to our listeners. Whoever would like to raise their hand digitally, I'll call people in order. And if I don't hear from people in a second, I'll start to go through the many questions that are in the chat, and we'll give it over to you.
Everybody's scared.
That always
I'm
happens
scared.
in the beginning. Hey, if one of you has a question, feel free to jump in. Anders, Harriet, or Glenn?
I'd like to take them both aside for hours and grill them on everything they know so I can learn more.
Yeah.
So it's really a pleasure
Likewise.
Can I be a fly on the wall for that one?
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
I don't have a question, but I have a comment. This question about how, in particular, cereals cooperate with microorganisms. I'm really not a specialist on this, but what we see is that it's actually not the dwarfing genes that is the main problem. It is, but there's not only one dwarfing gene. There's a lot of different dwarfing genes. Some are good and some are bad. You can actually have a huge root system in dwarfing varieties, whereas in other dwarfing genes cause the dwarfing of the overground and also the underground plant. So, but there is one general rule about modern varieties. That's also just about logic. I mean, what is good for the microorganisms in the soil is that plants release root exudates. And the more root exudates they release, the more microorganisms you will have in the soil. It's very simple. The organisms need carbon to survive. So therefore, and there's one thing that all plant breeders do, in particular in cereals, is that we want a high yield. And we want a high yield of grain, maybe also of straw, but mainly grain. So every time we select for a higher grain yield, you will also select for less leaching of exudates in the soil, because the sun energy can only be used once. So if you have a lot of carbohydrates that are released to the soil microorganisms, that will affect the yield negatively. So the modern high yielding varieties will also be low in leaching of nutrients into the soil. I've never studied it, but it's logic. This is how it must be. So that's one of the, and then you have to consider, do I actually want this? Do I want to have grain, or do I want to have microorganisms in the soil? And yes, I mainly grow wheat because I want the grain, but there is a trade-off. So you have to look at the whole system. That maybe the grain that you harvest is too expensive because you lose biology in the soil. So there's a trade-off, and this is good with microbiology, but there is a price. That means a lower yield. It may be different in vegetables, because vegetables is more about quality and forms and taste rather than actually tons per hectare. But at least this is how it is in grain.
Wait, I want to give over to Harriet there because I guess
Yes,
I would understand this
I'm-
as a non-zero sum game interaction. Go ahead.
I'm wriggling on my seat here. So the thing is basically yes to all. There is just one thing that I would like to expand this view in and on, and this is the capacity of plants to shift into another gear in photosynthesis, which is depending in part on the nutrition and on the capacity to handle this microbiome. So the same plant has the possibility just to produce a much denser chlorophyll and to arrange it differently and to intensify export. That means this is what I call a competent plant. If such a plant meets a microbiome which all the extra mouth to feed, it can do so. So it just will intensify the light capture. It will capture light it otherwise would not capture. And it just has a much more intense exchange and transport through this body and out. A stressed plant can't do it. And many plants are just simply not bred to do this anymore. And these plants, totally correct, will suffer yield losses when they have to feed a heavy microbiome. And also, if the soils are compacted, they would clog if a lot of microbiome develops there. And that means these plants are used to cut back exudation when they sit in compacted soils.
Very interesting. There's so much deeper we could go into this, but I want to hand over the question. So Daniel, you're first. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks very much. I work at, my name's Dan of a small farm in the UK in Somerset, and I work on vegetable landrace breeding. I'd really like to know what your views are on kind of the definitions we're talking about, particularly of landrace itself. My understanding really is the meaning, it's pretty synonymous with indigenous, I would have thought. So in that sense, how can you, when you're breeding a landrace crop, at what stage can you call it a landrace? I'm sure there's many different opinions on it. What do you think? Any comments?
Who wants to take that one?
Anders?
For me, a landrace is a variety that are maintained by farmers over a long period, and therefore develops the characteristics of the area and the genetic background that. So yeah, so the main thing is that it is maintained by farmer and has a high genetic diversity. So that means, if, for example, in my case, when I work with cereals and also I work with heritage varieties from Denmark, we don't have any land races. There's nothing. There's no maintenance of land races, and there's nothing in the gene banks from Denmark. There are some from Sweden and from other countries, but from Denmark, there's no land races preserved. There are accessions that are selected in land races, but they are more or less pure lines. So they lost the genetic diversity, and therefore it's not a landrace anymore.
Maybe the follow-up to that then would be, is it possible and how long would it take to get a pure variety or an industrial seed to become a landrace?
Depends also, it depends on whether it's a self-pollinating crop or a cross-pollinating crop. But you need the diversity. So the diversity should come from somewhere. And you can say, yes, if you compose it as I'm doing, just by a very narrow genetic pool of mainly modern varieties or a few old varieties. Yeah, even though we grow it for 30 years, it will still just be the same gene pool, unless there is some inputs from neighbors' fields, which will normally be modern varieties and therefore not really expanding the genetic pool. But there will be also mutations, and then you can talk about creating a new landrace if it has its own genetic development. So there needs to be mutations and new crosses developed in the crop. It's easier with a cross-pollinating crop because pollen will come from neighbors' fields and they will recombinate every year. But I don't think we can talk about a clear definition, but we can create our own definition.
Thank you. Does
I
anybody
have
want to add to that? Please go ahead,
Without
Glenn.
understanding
Go
that
ahead.
something that we need to maintain over a long time. Without that, it's not a landrace, my opinion.
I have something that I think is helpful. Starting in the early 80s, the rice geneticists that I did not meet until after 1995 and didn't start working with them until 2002. Everyone in my tier, which is sort of the farmer that's just doing stuff, thought rice was self-pollinating and would not cross. And my rice geneticist who was working worldwide, Dr. Anna McClung, who's now retired, but still is active, believe it or not, on a biosecurity and pro bono basis, which is admirable since she's worked everywhere on the planet. And before her, Gerdaf Kush, who was running International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines, they both said that they caught on to the fact that in the 80s, they started seeing cross-pollination on spontaneous basis with many rice varieties. We inherited one from Brazil that was a China cultivar that had always not been cross-pollinating, that immediately transitioned as soon as it was moved. You talk about phenotypic plasticity and reaction to terroir like wine grapes. Our basic landrace rice is thousands of years old, proven and in cultural histories for literally millennia, that would all of a sudden start changing and crossing with other rices. And we'd never seen that here until the late 50s a little bit, but in the 80s it started hitting. And the famous quote from Gerdaf Kush is, we started dealing with that in the 1980s and we were late. And now today, most of the rices we have, and that's over 200 that we do biosecurity on and grow in production, we have about 40 or 50. But most of the rices that we're doing research on and doing biosecurity on, they all will cross-pollinate just like corn. That really wasn't true a half century ago. Nobody knows what's driving the change. They only think about climate change. I don't think anyone has a hard answer on why these things are drifting this way. But just so you heard it, we're now having to buffer our rice fields just like we buffer our maize fields. You know, we don't need crosses. We still get crosses just from the sky. We get contamination from Africa in our rices sometimes on the coast of South Carolina in the United States. It's my 2 cents.
Wow, that's remarkable. Look, I want to give to the next question. Alexandra, go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. Good afternoon. My question is more from a practical sense, because we just started saving our own seeds. We produce around 150 different vegetables. And it's quite complicated for someone that hasn't done this before. And I wonder if there's any guide that you know of, or or a set of things that I should read or follow in order to do this correctly? Hello?
Whoever wants to take that?
Oh, sorry, no, my image and sound just stopped. Yeah. I wonder what direction should we take in order to do this as effectively as possible.
From my own dreadful experience, I can just tell you, restrict yourself in sample and species numbers and tend those that you have well. Because what very often happens is that you're just so amazed by all these possibilities, and then you end up making your bases or the individual numbers too small. And this works some years well, and then it starts to show brittleness. So take care that you have people that you share seeds with that really know what they are doing. That's important. And that you have many helping hands so you can really tend your stuff well. For me, one game changer in this whole thing was to discover how to store them best. I'm not a friend of freezing seeds at all.
No, yeah.
And so I had to face at one point, because I was distracted with other things, a big epidemic of moth, Indian meal moth in my seed chamber. And to get rid of something like this, once you have it, it's a nightmare. And it costs you huge effort and money, and you lose projects with something as stupid as this. So storing the seeds correctly and labeling them correctly so you know what you have is one thing that I would add to any resource that's out there on the market talking about how to thresh them, how to clean them, and all these things.
Yeah, all that. Yeah, select them and so on and so on.
So
Okay.
cleaning seeds, what I can highly recommend is this cleaner that was put forward with from Real Seeds, for example, in the UK. They have one how you can build from driven with a vacuum cleaner. So you just can really thresh them easily without having tons of different sieves. This is one thing that helped me a lot. And then finding the correct bags that work with a little window was one thing. And the third
that
one,
we have that. Yeah.
yeah, the third one was for the larger seeds like peas and beans. You try them in glasses, you try them in bags, you try them in freezers, you try them in this. It all didn't work for me. What worked is I recall that in the laboratory, cell culture flasks. They're plastic, clear plastic, so they're totally translucent. You can see through, you see whatever's going on with the seeds. And the best is, with a half a twist, air can go in and out, but no insect can go in and out. So they're lightweight, you can stack them, and you see what's going on in there. Has changed my life with seeds forever.
What's the name of what you just explained?
Cell culture flasks. It's just for the incubator.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. So at least this time in the laboratory has helped me for something.
Yeah, because at the moment we want to find someone that specializes in this area. But at the moment, what we're doing is that we're selecting the strongest plants with the characteristics that we want. We're trying to avoid cross-pollination with other plants and trying to save the seed from these plants. That's my question.
Instances,
if there's
cross-pollination. I mean,
sorry?
In some instances, you need and you want cross-pollination.
Yes, of course.
So watch
in
out.
some instances, you need.
Yeah. So the thing is, you may want to look. Who gives many resources is Fruition Seeds in the States. This is really, they tell you a lot about how to do it, and it's really reasonable.
How do you write the first one?
Fruition. I write it in the chat. I write it in. Yeah, exactly.
Oh, it just came now. Oh, okay.
This is a good
Fruition
resource
Seeds.
there. And
Okay.
I mean, this topic is so endless, especially because there are so many different vegetables we can't get lost in there now.
Exactly, and they all have their specific management. Okay. All right.
Yes,
That's
Harold
all. Thank you
Metz
so
is
much.
also really a nice book to have. Yeah. And there is many resources starting to tell you just this basic know-how, and the tricks will come over time. And this is
Okay.
what I mean with living with it. For example, corn breeding. In the
Mhm.
beginning, you just have the corn and you have it for seed, and you think, and I can't touch it. I would like to eat it, and I can't. So one year I thought, I just open the husk, I cut the top 2/3 or a third, depending on what it is. I have a meal and I have my seeds because I didn't need that many seeds.
Yeah.
And fair enough, the corn heals. You can retie the husk afterwards and you have it. Yes, you're told not to take the bottom seeds off the cob, okay, but it works. And this means the integration of seed saving and cropping. This is the bridge that needs to be done if you really want to
Okay.
live with this, because otherwise you burn yourself out. And then
Yeah.
you have an archive with 800 seed varieties, and yes, you can boast,
Yeah,
but you're
that's a
hungry.
problem that we're starting to
You're
see.
hungry.
We
Yes.
want, yeah.
So this is why I say the main thing is really to say, what do I love so much that I really want to live with it and maintain it and make it better? And then focus on this.
This is also a very good example of what is also very stressed in the plant treaty, International Treaty of Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, that it's not only about saving genes. It's not only about saving genetic resources. It is as much a question of saving indigenous knowledge of how to handle seed. Because if
Yeah.
seed is only stored in the gene banks and only maintained by seed companies, we lose this knowledge, and we may need it at some point.
Yeah, that's the main issue here, is gathering all the knowledge necessary to do the work. Yeah.
Great question. Any last tips that anybody wants to give there? Maybe Glenn, you got something?
Yeah, I do. In my experience, someone as dedicated as you are doing this kind of diversity, I think I mentioned earlier that had I not met Anders, it's just by luck. I heard tons about him, but he happened to be coming to the United States, and I immediately got on a plane and flew to wherever he came. I forget where it was I first met him, but it was enlightening. So my recommendation is to do what I just said. And what we've all said, I think, without saying it really clearly, you have to be able to reach out and quickly respond to people who know and share what it is that you intend to do. And in the case where you're talking about polyculture and we're doing fruits and other things as decoys, decoy crops, which is a crop to attract wild things, not to eat our main crops and things like that. No one's even mentioned that today, but that just bridges every sector of seed saving and every sector of food production, because if the animals don't have anything to eat, they tend to want to eat what you want to eat. So I say go look as fast as you can to find the expert, which you already mentioned you're going to do, and work with that person, because I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for people like Anders and everyone else, including my lovely cohort right here on the screen.
Wonderful. Thanks
Okay,
to
thank
all
you.
of you there. I'm going to hand over now to Jose.
Hello, thank you so much for this talk. I have two questions. The first one is for Glenn. I heard the podcast that you did with Oliver, and if I'm not mistaken, you spoke about these crops that grow very quickly, and I think you mentioned this again today. I wanted to know a bit more about it. What kind of crops are we talking about, and what are the benefits and eventually the downsides of it? And the second question would be, open for. It's a bit cheating because I speak about these things with Harriet, so but it's always good to ask. But how does the management influence the seed breeding or the development of varieties? I'm thinking particularly in terms of healing. So I'm working in Germany now in a farm that works with this technique called Dammkultur in Germany. But so it's basically ridging or healing. So these raised beds where people produce cereals in it and not only vegetables. And they've seen increases of protein content in 3% just by doing the ridges. And also the corn, the kernel size, way bigger. That was not measured, but I don't know. It's the double, I don't know, or more. And so that's the second question. How, or I was even thinking of I always mistake the order. Rice system intensification, is that the name?
SRY, system of rice.
SRI.
Rice intensification, there you're right.
Yeah.
And so how can these things influence the varieties for good, and what can we expect from these land races or from ancient varieties if we keep on getting the management better? Can we expect or is there unexpected things that can happen? This is the second question. The first is about quick crop. I hope this is not too much. Thank you.
Okay, I'll go really fast because we're going to run out of time and then get out of the way for the experts. But you mentioned short season crops, and I think this stems from my insistence to talk about 40 days to green pizza, which makes absolutely no sense. But pizza tends to be one of the most consumed foods now worldwide. I was sort of surprised to find that out, but I don't know why, because it's flatbread. But having said that, the idea that you have anthocyanin development in short season catastrophic recovery crops. So what's driving this is you farm, you're working with it, you've got really good seed and everything, and all of a sudden Mother Nature turns around on you and kicks you. And what do? And in our country, this is not true worldwide, and for sure in our country this has been receding, but you file for crop insurance and you get paid for the crop you didn't harvest. Our idea there was to wipe that system out completely with short season crops that could go to market. And it's concurrent with climate threats because we have both warming and cooling simultaneously in our country, and it's true worldwide. And in looking at sea level rise and the climate uncertainty, it's interesting that the land races that are very, very ancient, that are very, very fast in the field, which we don't pay a lot of attention to in our country, which a lot of other cultures do worldwide, we have walked away from that almost completely for staples. And we've also done it with a lot of vegetables. We've got long season crops, we've got short season crops. They're pretty out of balance these days. More time in the field. And so focusing on fast to recovery international seed searches is the fundamental. And we have an initiative, it's not public, but if I mention it, I suppose it's kind of public. It's called AM Research Initiative, and it's worldwide. And it's all pro bono, and it's a bunch of geneticists working on this. And so I get to do sensory tastes for all these short season crops, which is a lot of fun. And then I also get to trial them. We just go out and throw the stuff and walk away and come back and see what happens. That's the idea. That resilient, that vivacious. So that's my answer. Short season biosecurity.
Can you just name what kind of crops we're talking about?
Well, I'm doing it with full rotation. So I'm throwing polyculture out. So in polyculture, we could put everything from tomato to cucumbers, pumpkins, especially pumpkins, or anything cucurbit in with our cereal rotation with brassicas, et cetera, and just throw it out there and walk away and come back and find out what the food is. We're then indiscriminately feeding humans and wildlife. And if we're farming, then we have buffer crops that are decoy crops to take wild animals away from these things. So it's anything that works for us, we've got the core staples because we're not experts, but we've got a lot of experience in working with core staples. But the other side of the coin is we're throwing everything at it. And it's a load of fun because the food is actually really, really good. So who's objecting? Okay, hope that helps.
Thanks.
Marvelous. We are running out of time, so we may need to leave the discussion about different cultivation methods and the second part of your question for another time. But I will encourage all of you to join up with the Climate Farmers community. This is where we keep the conversation going after these panels. And I am very happy to nerd out with all of you on the WhatsApp group in there. So before we go, could each one of you of our panelists quickly tell our listeners where they can get in touch or find some of your resources? I know, Harriet, you've got educational resources. Glenn, you have so many things, and Anders. Maybe we can start with you. How can people get in touch?
Find my email somewhere. Well, in Denmark, I'm mainly active in what we call Landrace, which is a community that share the seed. So it's kind of a seed savers organization. It's mainly about cereals, and most of the cereals is something I made. But you can find the website somewhere where I'm mainly my main source of finding me. Yes.
Thank you, Anders. Harriet?
Me?
Yeah, I have been kicked in my butt for so long that I should make my resources finally available. That I'm just launching a website called agricurls.com. So there, these are going to appear in the near future. But it's
Cool.
already something there, so it's not totally empty.
Great.
Thank you. And Glenn?
Ours is easy. It's ansonmills.com, ANSONMILLS.com. And you can click on info, and I look at every inbound info email, believe it or not. I learned this from my geneticist. I learned how to tell which geneticists are most effective. Like I wrote Anders out of who's worked worldwide, and I wrote Anders out of Clear Blue Sky, and I was flabbergasted he replied to me. And he didn't have a clue as to who I was. And that started a collaboration with Ellie Ragosa here in the United States that went on, and I learned a ton. So I'm available. Anybody with serious stuff, go to ansonmills.com, write info@ansonmills.com off the website. I look at every email inbound, and I do respond 24/7, 365, because I'm always on the road. So
Yeah, I can attest to that. That's the way I got in touch with you as well. So thank you, all three of you, for being so generous with your time and your insights. It's been a real joy to connect with all of you again. This was like kind of my dream panel coming up. I'm so interested in the work that all three of you do, and the insights were super useful for me and the budding projects that I have here. Thanks to all of you who attended live and asked your questions. It was very enriching for the conversation. And like I said, there's a lot of ways to get in touch with all of us and keep the conversation going. So please look out for the next panel that will be coming up about the importance of community around agriculture and the ability of farms to work as vectors for community wherever they are. I look forward to seeing you next month, and we'll be in touch online up until then. Thank you all. Have a good rest of your evening.
Thanks for organizing, Oliver.
thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good to see you. Stay in touch.